Hello, and welcome to another edition of Shattered Lives, the Irish Daily Star's crime podcast. I'm Michael O'Toole, the paper's crime correspondent, and I'm joined, as usual, by our chief reporter, Paul Healy. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Mick.
How has your week been?
Mental, as per usual.
That makes me laugh. Listeners might know that I used to have your job where I was running around the country all the time, but I'm getting older and my legs have gone. So I'm trying to have the holding midfield role, and I've got you and John Hand, our colleague and the chief reporter in the Daily Mirror, who do all the running, and I have a more, what's the word? Well, lazy, possibly might be the word. But, you know, I've got you guys to do all the running and it's great, and it saves my knees. So you go around the country basically every couple of days.
We're the lackeys, yeah, I see. Right.
But I must admit, in my 30s and 40s, oh my God, I loved going around the country.
Yeah.
I really, really loved it. Do you like travelling so much?
Yeah, I do. That's why I signed up to be a reporter. So, like, I enjoy being on the road. That's where the job is. And this work from home thing is something that's only benefited me and my career, because I never work from home, really. My home is my car. As you well know, you're always on the road. Not every day, but almost every day. Because that's where the stories are.
Yeah, and I still go out on the road, but nowhere near as much as you. And I must say, it's a what's that saying? What seldom is wonderful. And I know that I was on the road to Mayo last week for the fatal shooting of a man over there. I won't go into it because there's another man charged. But just journalistically, it was great to get out on the road again. So I'm trying to, although you guys have the first go at getting out, I'm trying to get out myself a wee bit, because it is very, I find it very enjoyable. Okay, it's very stressful because we deal with serious issues, but I do quite like going out on the road and meeting people. One of the things that people don't realise, one of the best parts of our job is knocking on doors and talking to people and finding not even people that we're searching for, but, you know, people who may help us, just knocking on randomers' doors if we're lost. And how decent most Irish people are that we come across. Yeah,
I'll give an example when we're going to talk about the first story here of just how that works, the anatomy of a doorstep, so to speak.
yeah, very good. So we've got a few things to talk about, but one of the most important ones that we think we'd like to mention is Paul did a very good story in the Star and on the Mirror this week, where he confronted a convicted sex offender called Joe Dunne. Now, it was quite a remarkable interview, so I'd like to hear what Paul has to say about it.
Yeah, interview is an interesting word because it was more a confrontation, but you're quite used to that, Mick. We often have confrontations with people of this nature. We got wind of this story last Friday when it was in the courts that this individual, Joe Dunne, a former priest, had been convicted and sentenced in relation to the sexual assault of a young woman in the 1980s. And as I mentioned, he's a former priest, so that immediately struck my attention. There are certain stories that I suppose are bread and butter in a tabloid like the Star and the Mirror, and this is one of them. And when I saw that this Joe Dunne individual received a suspended sentence, I thought, right, there's an opportunity to track down and doorstep this person. A doorstep is a confrontation. It's arriving at somebody's doorstep and literally approaching them and asking them for comment. In this case, there was also another unique element in that the presiding judge jailed Joe Dunne to 4 years in prison, but then suspended the sentence entirely, not in terms of mitigating factors in relation to Joe Dunne himself, but because he is actually the sole carer for his elderly sister. She's in her 90s. And the judge felt it would be unduly unfair on that lady if Joe Dunne was jailed, because she would have no one to care for her. So that's a unique circumstance in its own right. Maybe you might remember a case like that, Mick, but I've not come across that in recent times where someone has been spared a jail sentence for the sake of somebody else.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I was reading another story just in the wires. We get all the court copy and stuff, and I obviously take an interest in all the cases. And I was reading there was a man, no, it's down the country, and I think it's still live, but there were various things said. And it was about a case of sexual abuse. And essentially the judge says in that case that caring, being the sole carer or being a carer, is not a good enough excuse to spare someone from prison.
Really?
So you see, I suppose every judge reacts differently.
Judge is different, yeah.
Yeah, it's up to the judges, as we say.
But yeah, it struck me as this is a case that perhaps we should highlight on a national level, go down and doorstep this individual and put it to him. Does he have an apology for his victim? Is he sorry for his actions? And is he grateful to have been spared a jail sentence?
So how did you find him? This always interests me. I love this bit. How did you get him?
As I mentioned, it's worth discussing. You brought up how a doorstep works, and this is a good example. I mean, I had an address of Ballycrystal, Geeshill, County Offaly, but it's very much a townland, and oftentimes, Mick, you don't always that's the address you get. It's a townland in the middle of nowhere, and it really was legitimately middle of nowhere. No offense to the people of Geeshill, but it's a small townland, and Ballycrystal then an offshoot of that. So I mean, really, you're talking a long stretch of road with 20 odd houses on it, maybe more. And myself and photographer Mick O'Neill were driving up and down this road, wondering which bloody house does he live in. And you're trying to kind of use your head a little. Okay, he's obviously going to be living in an older house, a bungalow perhaps, but you're trying to put two and two together. Effectively, we made the decision, right, we're going to have to knock on a few doors here and just ask, do you know Joe Dunne? Father Joe Dunne, as I said. It's important to provide, just in case people know him as a former priest or whatever. So knocked on a few doors, and lo and behold, just a couple of doors up from where he actually was living, a very nice gentleman answered the door and told me, I don't know, I'm only new here. I don't know anybody on the road. And I went, right, okay, I'm going to have to knock on how many more doors? And just as I was kind of getting ready to walk away, he said, but my missus actually, she was only saying to me that there's a former priest living in a house down the road there. And he just pointed to this yellow bungalow down the road. And former priest, and it's probably him.
I'd say there's a good chance of it being him.
So we went down and we did what's called a stakeout. The reason why we do this, why we don't necessarily just knock straight on the door, is because, look, there are various circumstances where we're trying to get people and someone else might answer the door, and then that's your only opportunity blown, so to speak. And you don't always necessarily have, look, to be honest, the best angle for a photographer to take a photograph of somebody from their front door. If someone is out in a public space, you have a greater opportunity to take a photograph of them, and you have every right to take a photo of someone from a public road, from a public space. So we sat outside the house for a period of time. We didn't actually have to sit for very long when Joe Dunne actually pulled up in his car and got out a bottle of milk in hand, and he started feeding some cats there in his front garden. So we thought that was the opportunity to confront him, which I did. And Mick O'Neill was taking photographs discreetly whilst I was approaching Joe Dunne, and he initially couldn't hear me. He's an elderly man, so I had to kind of effectively start shouting at him. Obviously didn't want to create a ruckus, but I was effectively shouting at this elderly man. I'm a reporter from the Star newspaper. Initially he was smiling at me and very friendly until until the penny dropped, so to speak, and he realized, reporter. And he kind of just lost it with me then. He said, I don't care, I don't want to know, I don't want to know anything about papers. And I didn't stay for long, but I put the important questions to him. Do you not have an apology for your victim? Are you grateful to be spared a jail sentence? And throughout all of this, I tried to be polite, no matter what my personal thoughts might be on this person guilty of a horrendous criminal offence. I was very friendly and courteous to him, but he was not equally as friendly to me. He was effectively shouting at me and telling me to get off his property, or he'd be calling the guards. So of course, the second he said that, I did leave. But we got fantastic photographs of him, of that doorstep, of that moment, and it was worth highlighting. And it's the story has done phenomenally well, because I think it has shocked people that I suppose a person can carry out such an offence, a historic sexual offence, and can be spared a jail sentence for rather unique circumstances. I don't want to go into too much detail in case it's harrowing for people to listen to. I suppose they can Google the case, but he indecently assaulted this young woman who was already in a vulnerable state. She was already the victim of sexual abuse, and he actually assaulted her whilst driving her to the rape crisis centre. So that'll tell you the kind of character that he is.
How do you find, you and I have both confronted an awful lot of sex offenders. I probably know the answer to this, but what do you make of them? I always find them sort of self-centered and self-pitying, and it seems that sometimes they regard themselves as the victims.
Yeah, it's difficult to generalize, but yeah, I've seen a lot of that in my time doorstepping. People who have committed sexual offences, they do seem to be quite self-centered, and talk about themselves quite a bit, not so much the victim. And as you know, Mick, like, we often do doorsteps. Okay, this is an example of a man who told me to get lost. He did say a couple of things before he told me to get lost, but oftentimes sexual offenders, they do seem to like to talk. And you nearly find 9 out of 10 times you're the one trying to walk away because they haven't stopped yapping. And it's usually, as you said, self-centered, all about me. I could give you a prime example. Just a couple of years ago, I doorstepped an individual named Paddy O'Brien. He was a quite well-known rapist. He sexually abused his daughter Fiona Doyle, and a lot of people would know Fiona Doyle. She's an outspoken advocate for victims. But it was all me, and I think I talked to him for a half an hour, and think eventually I had to say, right, Paddy, I'm off. Like, I couldn't really listen to it because it was all self-serving stuff and poor me kind of behaviour, and you probably have experienced that tenfold.
I doorstepped him myself. I remember I was out in it was done. This was a long time ago, because that was a long running saga about O'Brien and poor Fiona Doyle, who really is a tremendous advocate for victims. But we doorstepped him, and I remember the photographer. I'll talk about stakeouts because you raised this, and I want to talk about stakeouts. But the photographer got a great shot of him. I was, it's the usual standard pic of me at the door and him standing inside in the stair doorwell, I suppose, or the doorway, and he was laughing.
Yeah.
And the number of people of sex offenders that we confront like that, and they I don't know whether they're deluded, but they do. A lot of them do tend to treat it as a joke.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, he pleaded guilty, but yet he was still kind of like, yeah, I'm guilty, but it's not the way she's telling it, and trying to mitigate, and I think he even said at one point it wasn't rape, but I mean, it was rape. She was a child, and she was your daughter. And I think I put a kind of a hypothetical to him, like, if you were reading about somebody who had carried out the rape of their daughter, a sexual abuse of their daughter, what would you think of that type of person? And I think he said something to the effect of, that person would be a right bastard. So I mean, he could criticize himself in the externally, but when talking about it directly, it was all poor me, and yes, I did it, but I have excuses for why I did it. So when to walk away. But he's a good example of the self-serving type that we've encountered.
So you raised something there, and this is the beauty of this pod. It sort of meanders like a river, and topics come and go. You mentioned stakeouts. Stakeouts, the longest one I did, it was actually with Mick O'Neill. It was in Southampton in England, and it was for about 4 days. But when I say 4 days, I mean 24 hours. 4x4, we were sleeping in the car and stuff. It was horrendous, and it happened, and we got the man, and it was 4 days, but the confrontation or the approach lasted for about 30 seconds. It's like slow, quick, and then that's it. But stakeouts in the country are very, very difficult, I find, because in a housing estate in Lucan or Swords or whatever, you can to a large extent blend in, although I think you're spotted within 10 or 15 minutes wherever you are.
Yeah, generally speaking, and especially in an active housing estate, 100%. Yeah, you're.
And people see in the movies, I always laugh when I see in the movies about cops and stakeouts, and they're sitting there and they're having donuts and coffee, and they're nobody walks past, nobody goes, what the hell are you guys at? Because that does happen to us, that you're sitting in the car and within 5 or 10 minutes people come out, you see the curtains twitching, people go, you all right there, big lad? You know what I mean? That does happen. But rural ones are very difficult. Say if it's a ribbon development, as you were saying, there's one house, there's 20 houses. You have to pick somewhere, and you're literally the only car on the street, and people spot you very, very quickly. Like within a minute. It's like, what's going on there?
Yeah, they do. They're never really great fun stakeouts, are they? But I mean, I could give you plenty of examples of of incidents where we were caught quite quickly.
Have the guards ever been called to you?
Yeah, we've had that, and without naming the particular case, I can remember at one stage the guards came up to us and they thought we were quite suspicious, but as soon as we told them who we were and what we were doing, I would say they were quite supportive. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
Oh, they were like, oh, right, okay, and fire ahead. So.
Yeah, so and that one in Southampton, the English police came up and confronted us, and they were grand. We have our press passes and stuff, and they know the crack. I've had well over a dozen incidents with guards. I had one in Spain. We were staking out a fella. He got out in bail, and he was charged with a very serious offence, and we knew he got bail quite a distance away from where the incident happened. So we were staking him out, and I was so used to being confronted by Gardaí and English cops that we were outside this place for about 8 hours, and a Policía Local, a local police car, drove past us, and I said it was Mick O'Neill, who comes with us everywhere. I said, oh Jesus, Mick, they've spotted us. So because I spoke Spanish, I decided, F this, I'm going after them, I'm going to sort it out. So we drove after them and confronted them, and I started speaking Spanish. Listen lads, we're journalists from Ireland, showed their press passes on our passports. I said, we're just looking for this fellow, we want to talk to him. He said, oh yeah, no problem, fire ahead, and it was grand. But that just goes to show you how much it was at the forefront of my mind. Any police, here, we're in the doo-doo again. Because it does, because they do come up and say, what's going on? What is that? It's not as if people think, I sometimes think people watching the movies think a stakeout, you have an invisible shield around you where nobody spots you. Let me tell you, you're spotted very, very quickly.
Well, I did a stakeout with you, Mick, where you disappeared yourself, and I won't. We won't talk about that.
You had to mention it, didn't you? I was providing a service for you and Mick O'Neill, and you know it. Anyway, we'll talk about that another time. That
Maybe
was a
we
kind
can
of
talk about that another time. Yeah, there's only so long that you can sit in a car before you kind of do lose it.
Well, that's true, and it was in April last year when the sanctions were done, and the three of us went over to Marbella. We were trying to find a house where Kinnan, that was registered to Kinnan, and it was an address I had for Christopher Kinnan for more than a decade actually. So we were sitting outside it, and it was very warm in that car because you couldn't turn the engine on, you couldn't put on the air conditioning because you don't want to be seen. You try and keep a low profile, so it was extremely warm that day.
It was,
wasn't it?
But you did come back with McDonald's when you left us, so we forgive you.
Yeah, I did think of it. I want to talk about, actually, you know what? I'm going to tell you one very quick story about Spain and then we'll move on. It was another time, Mick O'Neill and I love telling this story because it's about just chancing. You chanced upon that house where the guy said, oh yeah, that fella lives down the road in the Ella bungalow. So in 2010, people will know that Operation Shovel happened when it was the big raids against the Kinnan cartel in Spain. So Mick O'Neill and I went over and we were there for a week. And on the Sunday, we didn't have really anything to do. So I came up with the brainwave of driving from Estepona to Torrevieja in Alicante. Marbella is near Estepona in the Costa del Sol. Alicante is on the Costa Brava. And that was an 8-hour drive. There was a man we wanted to interview. I'd interviewed him before in relation to, he was held in Spain in relation to the murder of two men called the Westies, who were infamous Irish criminals, Sugg and Coates, who were killed. And this man was held. Now, charges against him have been shelved, so I won't name him. But I'd spoken to him before, and we just thought, there's nothing to do. Let's drive for 8 hours. And I had a rough address, I had a phone number for him, and we were ringing it on the way, and it was dead. But I knew the pub that he was working in. I think he owned the pub at the time. Now, we'll call it the Mean Fiddle. That's not its name. So we're driving around Torrevieja. Now, Torrevieja, Paul knows Torrevieja. There's probably about 40,000 people there, aren't there? It's a big enough place.
It's pretty big, yeah.
Yeah, and we were driving along, and I was getting ratty with Mick because he'd been there for 8 hours, and his phone was dead, and we'd spent all this time trying to find him. So Mick saw this couple walking down this street. We were just in an ordinary street. Mick saw this couple walking down, and he said, "Why don't you speak to them?" And I always get ratty because I speak Spanish, I have to do all the talking, and after a while it gets on your nerves. So I grudgingly pulled over and I started speaking Spanish to this couple, saying, "Listen, we're just wonder if you can help us." And the fella said, "Sorry mate, I don't speak Spanish." And he was a dub, right? I said, "Oh geez, bloody hell, brilliant." I said, "Would you know this pub? We're looking for this pub," whatever fake name we're going to give it. And the guy said, "Oh yeah, I work in it." So it was 1,000,000 to 1 chance. And I said, "Oh Jesus Christ." I give him my card. "Will you give that to your boss?" And within 15 minutes the boss rang and we got a front page interview, and it was fantastic. That happens sometimes in journalism. You just come across lucky breaks. Yeah,
they say you make your own luck. Oh, you do. You make your own luck. You can get really lucky. They're not all like that. I wish they were all like that, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what do you talk about next?
I think we should talk about the case of Tina Satchwell, because we by the time this pod is out, we will basically be approaching the anniversary of her disappearance, which is on Monday, the 20th of March. So Tina went missing in 2017.
That long? I can't believe it's that long.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, and it's a case that I always think it's worth highlighting because it's just so baffling. Like, there are many missing persons cases, but this one, it just raises a couple of flags. And there's been a lot of there initially for 2017, 2018. There was a lot of publicity, and her Tina's husband Richard was always doing interviews and was constantly in the media. And then it kind of fizzled out because nothing really happened. But it's just a baffling case, and it's worth mentioning because today I made efforts, and I've been making efforts for the past couple of days to contact Richard Satchwell to ask him would he like to speak, do an interview, and he's quite reluctant to speak these days. He's somewhat tired of the whole thing and feels that he's repeating himself and repeating the appeal. And he did come back to me today and said effectively what else is there to say. I don't have anything else to say, and that's where he's left it. It's open to him to come back to speak to me, of course, but just to give people the basic facts of this case. Tina went missing from their home in Youghal in County Cork on the 20th, and Richard actually reported her missing 4 days later on the 24th. And they were a well-known couple in the Youghal area, but they were quite private in their own respect. Like, people would have known them to see them. They went to car boot sales, and Richard is a truck driver, so he would quite frequently be out of the country, all over this country. And indeed, we have tried to doorstep him a couple of times, and he wasn't there because he was off somewhere else driving a truck. But she disappeared on the 20th, according to Richard. The last time he saw her was he went out, and when he came back, she was gone, and there were 2 briefcases that were missing. And he claims that she took off with €26,000 in cash. To this day, she apparently has not accessed her bank account, and her mobile phone as well had not been used. So her family, certainly her sister Teresa, has said to me, how, if she is alive, how is she surviving? What is she surviving on? Richard has indicated that there were family issues, and the reason he didn't go to the guards immediately was because this apparently had been raised, and he thought that Tina had left to clear her head, as he said it, and he thought that she would come back. And it was only, say, 4 days later that he became concerned that she wasn't coming back and reported her missing. Now, he has been the subject of many interviews, as I've said, in which the question was put to him: do you think the Gardaí consider you to be a suspect? And did you have anything to do with her disappearance? He has emphatically denied on multiple occasions that he had anything to do with her disappearance. And he thought at one stage he was a suspect, but then felt later he wasn't. And cut to 2018 then, in March, really the only development, there was a huge search out in Mitchell's Wood in Castlemartyr. There was a tip-off from a member of the public that they had seen who they thought was Tina Satchwell with a man on the night she disappeared, walking into the woods. Do you recall that?
I remember, because I actually got the line that I remember the public said that it was a man walking with her into the woods. So yeah, and I can remember I went down to Castlemartyr for that search, and you're right, it was a very significant search. I remember I was also in Youghal trying to talk to Mr. Satchwell as well. You're right, I don't think he was in the day of the night. It was pretty early on after the disappearance that I went down. But yes, I was down there in Castlemartyr. Actually, when you were talking, I was racking my brains trying to think when it was, because I can't believe it's 2017. That's 6 years. My God, time flies. But yes, I went down, and I do recall at the time there was a level of confidence and optimism that they were going to find her there. But obviously they didn't. And it's, we can name them all. Annie McCarrick, so many disappeared women. And sadly, this seems to be the way of that going, that this is just going to be another unsolved woman case. But there's obviously a human story behind it. But just there is a number of women and a number of men as well who have just disappeared without a trace.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. You have to wonder at this stage, will it ever be solved? There have been 400 lines of inquiry, apparently.
Wow.
Interpol got involved. 200 statements taken, CCTV, everything. The guards don't believe that Tina left the country. They've said that. They don't believe she went to the UK. Richard initially believed that she might have gone to the UK to her family. Her family in the UK insists that she's never been in contact with them since going missing. There was a curious story that developed after her disappearance, that her mother, she grew up thinking that her sister, that her mother was her sister, and that she was actually raised by her grandparents, and she thought her grandparents were her parents. But I think Richard has said that wasn't the source of the family conflict, but it's a curious thing that kind of came out after the fact. Richard has never fully disclosed what this family issue is, and says it's up to Tina to come out and say what this family issue is. Similarly, the family in the UK have not said anything about there being any family issue. But he continues, or has continued to maintain over the years, that he thinks that might be the reasoning behind that. But look, it just remains a baffling mystery, and I think that's why it was worth mentioning.
Yeah, and so, say I've covered the cases of Deirdre Jacob, Annie McCarrick. When I started in journalism, they were current. Now they're sadly in a lot of people's memories. And I just wonder, in 15, 20 years, and you're still a journalist, will the case of Tina Satchwell be similar to that of Annie McCarrick, for example, that there might be a faint memory in your memory, or, some readers and listeners' minds? And that's quite sad when you think about it, because I've interviewed Deirdre Jacobs' parents, and they're absolutely lovely people, and they live with it every day. Same with Annie McCarrick's mother. I know she was in the media over the last couple of weeks, and obviously Mr. Satchwell is missing his wife. So it we can sometimes look at it and go, God, is it that long? I mean, I was shocked that it was 2017, but Mr. Satchwell has lived it every day. Deirdre Jacobs' parents live it every day. Annie McCarrick's mother lives it every day. It's not easy.
No, it's not, and I sincerely hope that we're not talking about it in 10, 15 years' time. Hopefully it is solved. Hopefully the answers do come. There was a Garda appeal this week. Look, we'll see if anything new comes out of it, but I always feel it's worth mentioning and worth covering, and we have to continue to keep these stories alive in the media. So hopefully the right person with the right information comes forward. I think it's worth talking about Stephen Silver and the death of Detective Garda Colm Horkan. Stephen Silver, today, as we're doing this podcast, has been found guilty of the capital murder of Detective Garda Colm Horkan, which as a crime that took place on the 17th of June 2020, which again only seems like yesterday. That was actually nearly 3 years ago now. But I can remember, you could probably remember vividly as well the day that happened.
Oh, I do. I remember that night, because we got word of it very, very late. I think it was 11:30 that we got to hear about it, and we got it confirmed practically towards midnight. And anybody in newspapers know that's extremely late. Now, we did get it in the paper that night, and I think you're quite right, Paul. June 2020. It doesn't seem that long ago, but it is. It's nearly 3 years. But yes, look, obviously he was convicted of capital murder. Today he had admitted manslaughter, denied murder, and there were several options open to the jury. They could have found him guilty of capital murder, which they did. Could have found him guilty of manslaughter, or not guilty by reason of insanity, because he did have, there was evidence that he had mental health issues, but there was also evidence that the action behind the murder was not as a result of an illness, but because of his personality. They'd had a fiery personality. So look, we always said it's up to the judges and the jury. I think a lot of people would have welcomed the capital murder. Now, capital murder is different because it's at least 40 years. You know that Aaron Brady is serving at least 40 years for the murder of Detective Garda Adrian Donoghue, who was in the same class in Templemore as Detective Garda Horkan.
Wow.
Terrible tragedy. Two fine officers. There was a wee WhatsApp thing going around afterwards, how they were in the same class and how they knew each other. So one class in Templemore, which is the Garda College, touched by two horrific tragedies. So Silver hasn't been sentenced yet, but it's mandatory. So it's in a few weeks, I believe, and it's going to be at least 40 years. Life in Ireland, it's open ended, but at the minute, it's really on average about 20 years. It could be 19, could be 20. Some people could be 16, but you're talking on average 20 years. So 40 years is a very long stretch. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it sends out a message, particularly as in Garda Síochána is a largely unarmed force, that if you're going to murder a Garda, the penalties will be much heavier.
Yeah, and the very tragic thing about this is that Detective Garda Horkan had only recently become a detective, and he was, I suppose, looking forward to that part of his career. He was carrying out his normal duties. He'd only just started his duty that day in Castlerea when he came across Stephen Silver. And look, obviously Stephen Silver, he's not a rational thinker, but when it comes to what happened to Detective Garda Horkan, I mean, he managed to take his gun off him and he fired 11 shots into him. He emptied that gun into him. I mean, just pure evil and absolutely, not the actions of a rational person.
And it's an indicator of the dangers that can happen to any Garda at any time. He wasn't going to a bank robbery. He wasn't investigating any organised crime groups. He was responding to reports that two fellas had been acting a Yahoo on a motorbike and been driving around and being loud, and Stephen Silver been shouting his head off. And that's why Detective Garda Horkan went to it. Yeah, and it went from 0 to 100 in a half second. And that's the risks that any Garda... Look at Tony Golden, who was murdered in Omeath. He was responding... He wasn't responding to a bank robbery. He was responding to a domestic violence incident. He was getting a woman out of house. Hundreds of Gardaí do that every single day. And hundreds of guards did what Detective Garda Horkan did that day. He went up to some fella and said, "What's the crack?" And then that's it. And that's the danger of being a guard.
And I remember the chaos of the scene. I mean, I went to Castlerea shortly after it happened, and I can remember speaking to people who, businesses and people in the area who witnessed and heard what happened. And I can remember there was a business there, I think it was a menswear shop, and there were bullet holes in the building. And it happened on a main street there, I mean, they're just pure chaotic scene. And look, the evidence in the case was equally extraordinary. Stephen Silver claimed, wrongfully, there's no evidence for this, but he was claiming that he believed that Detective Garda Horkan was trying to kill him, and that's why he did what he did. Don't think that excuses any action. But
and he also said he didn't know that he was a guard because he was in plain clothes.
Plain clothes, Tommy Hilfiger, yeah.
I mean, he was in an unmarked car, but guards are guards. You know what I mean?
Just on the psychological aspect, just there was evidence from Brenda Wright, the clinical director of Central Mental Hospital. She said that in her view, his thinking might have been impaired, and his judgment was impaired at the time due to his illness. But there was contrasting evidence then from a consultant psychiatrist, Harry Kennedy, who said that there was no positive evidence that Silver suffered a relapse of... he had a bipolar affective disorder at the time, and he said there was no evidence that had anything to do with his actions that day. And obviously the jury sided with that because they didn't find him not guilty by reason of insanity. They found him guilty of murder.
And if I'm correct, Professor Kennedy is the head of the Central Mental Hospital, which used to be in Dundrum, but is now in, I think it's Doorstepping in North Dublin. So that's where people, who are, for example, people who are acquitted of murder by reason of insanity are sent there. They're not incarcerated, but that's where they're placed, shall we say. And they don't have liberty to leave. I mean, they effectively are in there against, despite what I'm not trying to call them prisoners, but despite, for their own safety, and they have to stay there. So it's effectively serving a sentence, but it's in a hospital. So he's a very popular man, and you and I would probably both know lots of Gardaí. This is the thing about the guards. Every guard probably knows personally 700 or 800 at least Gardaí, because you train with people, you work in different units, you work in different parts of the country. So a lot of people would have known Detective Garda Horkan, and he was heavily involved in the GAA as well. So look, he was from what we know, the people who we know who knew him, loved and respected him, and he was a very, very, very good guard.
Absolutely. I think I'll just I'll briefly read just the statement that was released there by Colin Horkan's brother Brendan, which was just after the verdict today. He said, we were horrified and shocked to the core to learn of the circumstances that led to Colm's death as he went about his job policing the streets and keeping the general public protected and safe at all times. Colm was a fantastic son, brother, uncle and friend, and his memory remains etched in our minds every minute of every day. And today's verdict will give us some closure, but will never replace the man who was the glue of our family that bonded us all together. We love him dearly.
He sounds like a mighty man. Okay, well, we'll leave it there for this week, Paul.
I think so, yeah. We've discussed a lot.
On that note, and in memory of Detective Garda Colm Horkan. So we'll be back next week. I've done an interview, which is a really excellent interview. It's about policing, and we should that should be out on Monday afternoon. But I would urge people to listen. It's a really fascinating topic. So I won't say much more than that, but I would urge people to listen in. And thanks for listening to us today.
Thank you.